welcome everybody. And remind folks that if you go to the chat room, you'll be able to type in questions. We also do an evaluation and it will be in the chat box. They can click on that at the conclusion of the program. And we appreciate folks filling that out and sharing information. As we move into the program, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Betty Berning. She's from Betty Berning Consulting. She develops ag sustainability strategies and metrics for farmers, co-ops, food companies, kind of specializes in creating farm to table businesses. She has a true interest and love of economics, financing, and many of you will recognize her as one of the writers for the Dairy Daily Agenda. And, we always get a good dose of what's going on in our trade every day with that. Betty, appreciate you taking the time to be here, and we will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, very good. Well, I am really happy to be here. Can you all see the right screen, hopefully?
Sure can. Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm just, yes, I am really excited. I see all the different, I'm trying to like scroll through my Zoom and see all the people that are on here and watch the chat and run a presentation and update markets all at once. So we'll see how this goes today, but maybe in the chat, if you want to maybe say what like what part of the industry you work in, if you're a producer or a lender or a feed sales, I would be really interested in that. And then I'll kind of start with my intro while we're doing that. So I did slightly change the title. The title was really exciting. It was long-term dairy supply and demand. And I changed it to macroeconomics and the dairy economy. So I hope that I really made it much more exciting for you enjoying this. In all honesty, as I talked with the organizers and some other folks in the industry, the feedback I got was, hey, would you be willing to talk a little bit about just what's going on in the macroeconomy? How is that impacting dairy markets? And what is that going to mean more short term? So we're changing the scope a little bit. We'll have time for questions at the end. I'll gladly talk about longer term trends too, but I thought it might be kind of interesting to talk about the macro things today too. And I see a couple people have followed directions and chatted. Thank you. Okay, we have some lenders. Perfect. I hear lenders are a tough audience. I presented in Pennsylvania in September, so that was kind of the joke out there. It's a tough crowd. All right, so like Fred already mentioned, I write for Daily Dairy Report. We are, as the name says, a daily publication, and we cover all things dairy. So one day we might write about ice cream consumption. The next day we might write about milk production. The next day we might write about Chinese imports, and then the next day we might write about current market conditions and what's going on in the butter market. So honestly, it's a short publication. It's 300 words, Monday through Thursday, and then Fridays are like 550. It's very short. I love that about it. If you read it for a whole year, you will have a very good idea of what's going on both in the domestic dairy market and the international dairy market, but also just kind of like trends and things like that too. So I love writing for it. There's a couple of us that write for the publication. If you aren't subscribed, we are $120 per year. And what that boils down to is about, everyone loves this, right? I sound like I'm an infomercial. It's 50 cents a day. So, consider it, check out our website. We update markets every day too. We're a great place to get your market information. That's what I was trying to do here. Hi, Trent. How are you? Good to see you. You can tell, he says he's a dairy economist too. You can tell me if I get it right. So I like to put a little humor in, and this is different presenting virtually too, because there's not as much of a response. So hopefully I'm not driving you too crazy and we can lighten the mood a little bit. What doesn't make the bio, but should make the bio, I like to joke about. So in my free time, I repair things that my sons break. You can see they created something on the swing set there, and that the sod was wore out. This is a funny and true story. We replaced that sod. and they helped me. I watched Bob Vila, this old house. We figured out how to do it. I was really happy. We went on vacation. We watered the sod. Winter came, spring came, summer came, and they wrecked it. So we had to replace it a second time. And on the way home from the sod farm, which by the way, they had a lemonade stand and they had to pay for the sod, on the way home, they said, Mom, we can't wait to go to the sod farm again next summer. So this is summer number 3, and we did not go to the sod farm, which I am very happy about. So we repair a lot of broken things around here. No one's hand was burned in the middle picture. So yeah, I make a lot of sandwiches. They seem to like my peanut butter jelly. And then my brother has a dairy farm that's really close by. So we actually go over there quite a bit. They had a garden this summer, and I've been joking that we're going to start Betty Berning and Sons Enterprises, and you know, we'll have some garden vegetables. And as a kid, we had Guernsey cows on the farm. So my poor brother, I've been pestering him like, oh, my boys could start a Guernsey herd again. So I don't think that's going to happen, but it's fun to dream. So anyway, that's a little bit more about me. Here's what I'm going to talk about today, though. Back to the serious part. So are we headed towards a recession? That's the first thing I want to talk about, and I'll give you the answers right now. There's a good chance that a recession is coming, particularly in other parts of the world. And so I'm going to talk about like factors we've seen before that have come together, and then we've had a recession. And history doesn't always repeat itself the same way. So you know, you can take it or leave it. The second thing then, if there is a recession, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for dairy markets, and what does it mean for farmers? So, you know, the takeaway there is that demand will likely decline from the developing world if there is a recession. That said, dairy supplies are not really poised to move that much higher, and global dairy supplies have been pretty weak for the past year. So even if there's a dip in demand, some of the limited supply is really going to temper that. So that should help with prices. And then the last thing is just how do I know what do I know? What am I watching? What am I looking at? What might be good for others to be just looking at to get an idea of where markets are headed or where we might be in terms of a recession. And some of it's things you might already know, and some of it's maybe more qualitative things too. So with that, I will get started. I'm just gonna I will try to wrap up by 12:45 too, so we have time for questions. So first thing, gotta get this to advance. There we go. All right, a recession is looming on the horizon. So a lot of people think that a recession is simply 2 quarters of declining GDP growth. And that is actually not the definition of a recession. Recession is something that's declared by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it has to do with a number of factors, including personal income, unemployment, consumer spending, but there is no fixed definition of a recession. And that's what makes some of this, like why people keep throwing this word around, are we in a recession or not? There isn't one hard and fast definition. There are often similar factors, though, between recessions, and that's a little bit of what I'm going to talk about in my next couple of slides. But the quick answer is there's no hard and fast answer to are we in a recession. And oftentimes, one more thing, oftentimes we declare a recession, or a recession is declared once we're in one. So it's kind of looking backwards at the data. So with that said, while it is not required, like I said, there's a reason why everyone assumes that we're in a recession if we've had 2 quarters of declining GDP growth. You can look at the chart on the screen and see that that's usually what happens, isn't it? So these gray bars are times of recession, and then the blue line is gross domestic product and quarter on quarter change. And you can see typically that's exactly what happens. So it's not a bad thing to be looking at or to be following. If you see a quarter of declining GDP growth, good to keep an eye on, because if you have a second quarter, well, it's not the hard and fast definition. There's a very good chance that a recession could be declared at that point in time. All right, so why else does everybody keep talking about, are we headed towards a recession? What's going on? Well, inflation, right? We are in a highly inflationary period right now. what most people look at is the CPI, Consumer Price Index. That was the latest one, was released this morning. It's not on this chart here. Sorry, I'm not that good. But the latest one was released this morning, and it, let's see, the CPI changed 7.7% year over year. In October, what does that mean? Well, we've been over, you can look at the, see if I can get my pointer to work. Yes, we've been over 8% from, you know, a good chunk of 2022. So it tells us that while inflation is still increasing, it's increasing at a decreasing rate. So inflation may be starting to cool. And you can see here on this chart too, that those bars again are a recession. And oftentimes when we are headed towards a recession, we see inflation rapidly increasing, and it really doesn't peak until we are, you know, in the midst of a recession. So that is why so many people are so concerned about this. And a lot of you might already know this, but I think it's a really good, I like to have this slide in there because it's a really good visual of what goes on and how long does it last and at what point does it start to get better. So inflation often leads to a recession. Well, what happens when there is inflation? In times of inflation, the Federal Reserve tends to raise rates, and then in times of recession, the Fed lowers them. And you can see this relationship that during a recession, the Fed wants people to spend more money, wants GDP to grow again. So they decrease rates so that people will want to spend and borrow again. And when we put all of this together, both inflation and interest rates, this is what we get. So it kind of becomes a cycle. So in times of high inflation, the Fed will try to manage that by raising interest rates, which is what they've done. And then a lot of times that is followed by a recession. Obviously, the Federal Reserve is trying to avoid that. They've been pretty clear that they're hoping they can manage the inflation such that there isn't a recession. History would tell us that that's not often how it goes, but it could this time. Maybe they were proactive enough. I would say too, like, I only have 50 years of data. I'm getting older. It's only 50 years. But if you look back further in history, you can see the Fed hasn't always been quite so proactive in terms of trying to manage recession. They used to, I would say, let the markets kind of dictate things a little bit more as we go further back in history. So the cycle, the takeaway here is that we have inflation, the Fed raises rates, and a lot of times then there's a recession. Another thing that people like to watch in terms of trying to determine, you know, is a recession actually coming, is unemployment. So our unemployment rate has been very historically low. I think we're at about 3.7% right now. And I mean, it could go lower, sure. It could absolutely go lower. Will it? History would tell us probably not, because it's very near, you know, a historically low rate. But what we tend to see is that unemployment starts to jump up, and then we're in a recession. And then towards the end of the recession, you see unemployment numbers fall. That's not perfect, but if you think about what's been going on now, we've had increasing inflation, increasing interest rates, and then unemployment is really slow, and it's starting maybe a little bit to tick up. This makes everyone very nervous because you can see the gray bars on all these charts. When do gray bars happen? High interest rates, high inflation, and when unemployment starts to increase. So while history never perfectly repeats itself, these factors can tell us a lot about what's going on in the macroeconomy. Okay, so that is why so many people are worried about, is there a recession coming? All these different things going on. So what does that mean for you? What if there is a recession? What's that going to mean for farmers? What's that going to mean for markets? Let's start with the first one, because we already talked about interest rates. Land prices and land rents tend to decrease as interest rates increase. So this makes expansion really difficult when interest rates are high. And this is a model from the University of Illinois Extension, just showing the correlation between as land rents increase, or rather as land rents and land prices decrease, interest rates tend to go up, or the other way around, I guess is how you'd say that. So that means right now that we may see land prices or land rents go a little bit lower, or else we just won't see any expansion because people won't be able to it'll be difficult to afford. We're already seeing this in the housing market. The average house price of a house has come down since the Fed has started to raise rates. That started in March, and I have in my notes that the Fed's raised rates 3.75%. So just to try to put this in perspective, what does this mean? So let's say I borrowed $1 million at 3%, and I did this before the Fed raised rates. Now let's say I borrowed the money today, and I borrowed it at 6.75%. So I could have borrowed it at 3%. I waited for some reason, and now I'm borrowing the $1 million at a much higher rate. What that means is I'm going to wind up paying $817,000 more over 30 years in interest. That's pretty significant. Or put differently, in terms of a monthly payment, I'm paying close to $2,300 more a month because of that rise in interest rate on $1 million. So it's very significant. And it will make expansion, like I keep saying, expansion difficult. It makes it hard for it's hard to access land if you're a new farmer. It makes high interest rates make it all that much more harder. And then for high debt operators, I think it's going to be really difficult to manage. Even if producers aren't thinking about buying land or expanding, most producers have an operating loan, and those interest rates are going to go up too. They have gone up. So expect higher interest rate expenses, and as a result, tighter margins and less expansion. It's the operations that are, low debt or more cash heavy that are going to be able to do some of those things and take advantage right now. So that's kind of a little bit about the supply side of things. If a recession hits, demand from developing nations may decline. And up here I have a chart from the International Monetary Fund with a forecast for GDP growth over the next few years. So you can see 2021, there's a big bounce back after the COVID-19 shutdowns, but this year GDP is expected to be lower in the developing world and then flat next year. In the developing world, when there's less income available, they trade out of dairy. And so they'll buy, cheaper proteins or just more carbohydrates because they just can't afford to pay for dairy protein. So it is quite possible that we'll see a decline in export demand, especially from the US. And we'll talk more about some of the other reasons for that. But yeah, in the developing world, it would appear that GDP growth is going to be lower this year and, not a lot of growth into next year. We're already starting to see some of this demand fall off. So this is Chinese demand for powders. I can tell you that butter and cheese imports look a little different for China right now. They've been increasing, but in terms of powders, year to date, powders are actually Chinese imports are actually down. And, you can certainly tell the story, and you can see it in the slides here, that 2021 was a record year. China imported a lot of whole milk powder, a lot of skim milk powder. So maybe this year's just, we're coming off a record year. A lot of people said, hey, China has lots of powder in their inventory. So, maybe they're just not buying as much. All that may very well be true. We also know that China's economy is kind of sputtering a little bit, or not as robust as it typically is. And some of that's due to their zero COVID policy, which really seems to be impacting their production of goods. And then they're also having some issues in their real estate market. So those two things, they go into GDP, and GDP is a measure of economic health. So yeah, it could very well be that China's just, full on powder. Likely that's some of it. And then some of it is probably, things are not as good economically right now due to the COVID-19 policies and due to the real estate market. What about dairy markets here in the US, or what is going on with dairy markets? So I talked about, supply a little bit. We might not see a ton of expansion, might see waning demand from other parts of the world. Things are they feel a little bit unsettled. I pulled charts for the major commodities for the last 3 months. Butter was at an all-time record high at the end of September, and now has really corrected in the last week. It's still trying to find its footing. It was up 1/4 cent today in trading. I'm not that good. I didn't pull today's numbers, but these are pretty close. And then you can see black cheese has been rallying, but then non-fats down. Whey prices have been really sideways. So it's kind of tough to know what's maybe coming up next. And honestly, I could probably give a half-hour presentation on each one of these commodities, talking about what's going on here in the US, what's going on globally, talking about it's not just, milk supplies and demand that are impacting these things. There's also supply chain issues that are coming up, and weather issues, labor shortages, all sorts of other things that have impacted these markets and ultimately driven prices. But things are they feel a little bit unsettled right now, I would say. And so I kind of been painting a little bit of a doom and gloom picture. I feel like I want to point out one bright spot here, because I keep saying, like, well, demand's probably going to fall off, and like, look at these different commodities, like some are rallying, but some are falling, and we don't really, it feels unsettled. 2021 for the US was a record year for dairy exports by volume, but 2022 is actually shaping up to be better than 2021 was. And that's even with the strengthening dollar. And you might be thinking, wait, whoa. You just said that we're headed into a recession, that demand is, waning. I know the dollar is strong. Everyone's been talking about that. What in the world is going on? How can the US be exporting so much? Well, we are not in a recession yet. The US isn't. In other parts of the world, while things are weaker, they're not necessarily in a recession either. So the demand has been there at least earlier in the year. And another thing to kind of notice or keep in mind is, like, there are two sides to all of this. There's demand, and that's certainly very important, but there's also supply, which I've talked just a teeny bit about. Global milk production really for the past year has been on the decline. So when we look at Australia and New Zealand, they milk like summer to summer, our summer to our summer. So they're in springtime right now. Last season for them, for both countries, was pretty poor. And this season so far is shaping up to be pretty poor. So last year they were down on the previous season, and this year they're down off last season. So those are not good signs. There's different reasons why both countries are down, but they're down and they're in their springtime. So this is like peak time over there. And they've been down. So that's some of what's been driving the lower milk production. Europe has also been down in terms of milk production for the past year. I am hearing that October was likely like a year-over-year increase in Europe. However, that's an increase over like a pretty weak comparison. So maybe there's a little more milk in Europe than there was a year ago, but there wasn't that much a year ago. So with all of that said, it means that there hasn't been a lot of excess dairy. So that's why US exports have been strong. If importers could find product, they bought it. And then even though the dollar has been really strong, and I am going to get into a dollar chart in a little bit here, I'll show you one. We had been cheaper relative to other countries. I can't say that that's the case today, but we had been cheaper earlier in the year. And if you think about what prices were earlier in the year too, they were quite a bit, in some commodities, lower than where they got over the summer, especially like in the butter space. So this weaker global supply is really what's opened the door for US dairy exports and is allowing 2022 to be so strong to date. Will supply get better? Okay, so you're saying that, supply is an issue. Well, expansion is going to be tricky, really due to a lot of different reasons, and I'm just going to let them populate up. And this is not just expansion in the United States, but some of these really pertain to other parts of the world too. Interest rates are high. So we already talked about farmers are going to be paying. If they want to expand, it's going to cost a lot more. And then if I purchase feed costs have gone, it's expensive right now. If you're purchased feed, it's expensive. Then we've had all these weird supply chain things, right? It was hard to find labor before COVID, and now it's really hard to find labor. And that's true at the processing level too. So it's not just farmers, but also plants now that are struggling to, keep their workforce in full force. Then we have policy issues too, which really limit expansion, both here in the US and then in other parts of the world too. As I think about like New Zealand and Europe, for example, there's limitations due to some of the goals related to carbon neutrality. So there's limitations on how much a producer can expand or what kind of footprint they can take up. And we see some of these things even here in the US, like different companies, governments, local governments, federal governments, they all have goals around these different environmental regulations, but they do limit dairy expansion. So all these things really make expansion a lot harder. Oh, and we have some supply management programs here in the US too, right? Limited processing capacity. How did I forget to say that? Limited processing capacity. So as you all know, like a lot of co-ops in different parts of the country, you can give your co-op your quota or the amount that you've agreed to, and that's it. So it makes it tricky to expand then if you don't have a home for the milk. So for many different reasons, and this could also be a half-hour slide, expansion is going to be hard, and that means there won't be as much supply. So your takeaway here, like I said, is yes, demand. If we are headed into a recession, which it appears, certain parts of the world maybe, and maybe even here in the US, then demand will likely drop off, which could cause prices to decline. That should be tempered though by the fact that dairy supplies are not going to rapidly increase due to expansion, because expansion is just really tricky in most parts of the world right now. So with that said, what am I watching? How do I know all these things are going to happen? This is what I would say. Talk to other people in your colleagues in the office, if you have access to any of the other market research. Talk to those people and just get a sense of, hey, what's going on? Like how, what are you seeing in terms of butter sales, cheese sales, retail demand, food service demand? All those things kind of help you to pull together a story. And when we talk with other people, we can kind of start to figure out, well, what is the market story today? What do I read? I really like to read like for all the macro stuff, because the macro things really are what wind up driving the dairy market and wind up driving decisions. I like to read Bloomberg. I read the Associated Press every morning. They have a morning publication. And then I read this fancy publication called Daily Dairy Report, which goes over a lot of the things that I've already talked about in the presentation. So again, I'll put a plug in for that. I also watch, the basics that I've already showed you, looking at, what's CPI doing? That's our measure of inflation. What are interest rates doing? What's unemployment doing? What's GDP doing? All those things are going to give you a really good idea of what's going on in the local, the domestic economy, but also the international economy, and help to shape then, what is that going to mean in terms of demand, in terms of supply, in terms of decisions that consumers are making, in terms of decisions that farmers are making. And you can start to create this story about where markets might be headed. So with this last little icon here, there are other things that I watch too, besides just these basic data points. And I want to talk about some of those too. So, oh, and last thing, don't get hung up on finding the it factor. So I like to bring up the Baltic Dry Index. I don't know, any of you know what that is? If you do, good job. Most people don't, but here's the thing. When I started trading dairy markets in 2008, right, when the recession started in 2008, that was the it factor. That's what everyone talked about. Look at this Baltic Dry Index. It told us a recession was coming. Look at what it's doing. This is the thing. Nobody talks about it anymore. And maybe it's still I don't know, maybe it's still a really good indicator of recession. I don't know, but that was the it factor. Don't spend, I would recommend, don't spend your time trying to find like the it factor, the thing that tells us what's coming. Just try to get the basics. Look at the basics. That's going to give you a lot of information. I've said history does not always perfectly repeat itself, but it is interesting that I can paint a pretty good story that, you know, in times of high inflation and high interest rates, we tend, and, you know, rising unemployment, we tend to have a recession. If you're following these things, you're going to have a pretty good idea of where things are headed. So with that said, I do want to touch on the dollar. It is the strongest it's been in 20 years. And again, you might be thinking, you painted all this doom and gloom. You painted that things are so bad. What do you mean the dollar is so strong? Well, I think the dollar still is the safe haven for, you know, when we think of currencies, or right now it is anyway. And it's really interesting. The dollar really hasn't been this high very many times, like three, 4 times over this whole graph. This graph only goes back to, but how many years is that? 35 years. We're going to call that 35. It's a little more. It's only been there a few times. And so why is the dollar so strong right now? Well, I think the US is in a better spot than a lot of other economies. So if we think about like the Eurozone, they're dealing with the war in Ukraine, very high energy prices. And I think that crisis has really weighed heavily on the economies over there. I already talked a little bit about China, but they're sputtering a bit with the zero COVID policy with real estate and some of those things. Japan, a big part of their GDP is exporting goods, manufactured goods, and they're just not manufacturing as much. So all of those things, you know, when we think about where the US is at, we're not dealing with some of those things quite as heavily as maybe other parts of the world. Something else too to keep in mind, we have a younger working population than other parts of the developed world. So, you know, the average age here in the US is like 38 and a half years old. When you look at like Europe or Japan, that's higher. So we have more people that are just able to contribute to our GDP because they are working. So the dollar is really strong. And like I've already said, even though we do have a strong dollar, it wasn't so strong over the summer when we were sending all those exports and we were still cheaper than the rest of the world. So that's kind of how, in terms of dairy, the US has been able to be competitive this year. Because typically what you will see when there's a strong currency is fewer exports. And so that may be something that starts to crop up now as US prices get more expensive than other parts of the world. Another thing I'm watching pretty closely is just weather. And so when we used to watch weather, we would just think about like crops, you know, is there going to be a crop or not? What do the crops look like? What's production going to be like? Certainly that's important, and that has an impact on cows, right? Especially if I purchase feed. So if there's a drought, you know, it can wind up having a big impact on cows. If it's hot, right, that's going to impact cow comfort and yields. But, you know, when you look further out too, if the feed that was made isn't very good or it's very expensive and people need to substitute, you know, 6 to 12 months after the drought, you can see an impact too on productivity. Okay, so that's one part of it, just the crop side of it. But I think we've all seen over this past summer, like there's a lot more to drought than just the crops. There's also these really low river levels that we've seen in Europe right now, the US with the Mississippi, and even in China, one of their main rivers is very low over the summer too. And that winds up impacting like barge transportation. So we can't move goods around like we need to. It also impacts hydroelectricity. So these droughts, they certainly are really important to watch because of the crops, but there's also all these other things that they're starting to bleed into now, other parts of the economy that wind up coming back to dairy that make it really important just to keep an eye on and understand like what is the bigger implication of drought here besides just, you know, we're going to have lower corn yields or something. I think with increased drought too, like the reservoirs out west are pretty low, but I think we're going to see more on water rights as well. Like some states are already trying to hash out like Lake Mead and Lake Powell and all these big reservoirs out west. Who gets the water? How does this get divvied up? So it's something to keep an eye on. And I think it's going to become more of a policy thing in the future. Another thing I'm really keeping a close eye on is just the situation in Ukraine. So, you know, there's still a war there, and Ukraine is a major exporter of agricultural products. The ports are open again, but I think depending on the day, it's kind of like how much longer will they be open? Some days it's like, it's fine. You know, it seems like things are going well and they're not going to close ports. And then other days it's like, I don't know, will they stay open or not? So Ukraine is a major exporter to Europe. They're a major exporter in terms of wheat, corn, world's #1 sunflower seed oil grower. So they're really important. And if they can't get goods out, that's going to make everything get that much more expensive. Or if they can't get a crop in, it's looking a lot better than when the war started. So that's good. But I am keeping a close eye on it because it winds up impacting not having a major player in the world grain trade market, winds up having a major impact on crop prices. Another thing that I am watching right now is just energy prices, right? Because that's going to wind up having hitting a farmer's bottom line, right? If I see my input costs going up, and they are going up, that's going to tighten my margins, and that makes it hard, right, to make a profit. So just watching that, and that's going to influence cost of production. And then also watching, you know, corn and soybean prices. So for farmers that purchase feed with rising energy prices and rising feed costs, yeah, margins are definitely going to be pretty tight next year, especially if we see prices, you know, maybe not as low as they were a couple of years ago, but lower than they were this year. That's going to make for a pretty tight margin. And you can see too, I was trying to just think a little bit about the correlation between recession and corn and soybean prices. And I don't know that the correlation is as strong as some of these other relationships I've shown you, but I think it's fair to say expecting that corn and soybean prices might get lower during a recession that's not a ridiculous expectation by any means. You can see if you look at those gray bars that, yeah, prices have fallen during recessions before. If you think about inflation falls during a recession. So the price of food is going to fall. Demand, we've talked about how demand might go away. So demand may go away too if people maybe don't have as many cattle or aren't, you know, aren't driving as much, don't need as much ethanol, whatever, you know, you make up the story of what it is they're not, where less use is happening, but that is a possibility that prices could go lower there. And then just kind of the last big thing that I'm keeping an eye on, and checking my time too, I have 5 minutes and then I'll take questions, is policies. So I've already said it, expansion is getting trickier. In other parts of the world, like especially New Zealand and Europe, but even here in the US. And so just keeping an eye on these environmental regulations, because it is changing the way dairy supply is growing. So I can give you a couple examples. Think about like over the summer, there were these big protests in the Netherlands over, you know, proposed laws about nitrogen emissions, but basically it would mean many livestock farmers would need to exit the business over there. And then like in New Zealand, one thing that we're seeing is New Zealand's a grazing based model, probably as most of you know. And so in New Zealand's about the size of Colorado. So at a certain point, you can only graze so many animals, right? And they're kind of at that limit. But then something else that's happening is the government is saying, hey, let's keep the animals away from freshwater sources because we don't want pollution, right? So we're going to take away some of the land that you have. Well, if I shrink an already small land base and make it even smaller, it makes it that much harder to make the same amount of milk that I was making before. And I really have to rely on productivity gains to increase my supply. So all these different policies, you know, whether you agree or disagree with them, they do make it harder to expand because they're limiting. You know, we can't just put up a big dairy wherever we want and hope for the best. We gotta, you know, manage our air and our water and our carbon offsets and all these things. And this is something I shared this when I was out east too. It was something I hadn't realized, because we think about like, well, California has a carbon neutral goal and it's by 2045, and China wants to be carbon neutral by 2060. It's all these governments. US Dairy actually has a goal too. I didn't know this. Maybe you all know this, but they actually have a net zero initiative too by 2050. And that's being championed by several groups within the industry, including National Milk Producers Federation. So it's kind of a conglomeration of both processors and producers. But it's something, I guess my takeaway, why do I share that? The takeaway here is that I don't think it's going away. And so it's going to be something that people just need to, you know, stay abreast of changes. So I alluded to it, but yeah, there's many things that are going to play into the like even longer term into the dairy economy. And we've touched on some of these. So wars, what's weather, and then policy related to that. Our population, especially in the developed world, is aging. So people may consume different products. It's also going to impact GDP. We saw, you know, COVID-19, there was this huge global shutdown, and that had an impact on GDP and demand and prices. And then with COVID-19 too, we saw that our supply chain can be disrupted. You know, there can be labor issues, there can be trucking issues. So all these things, you know, this is kind of what I like to keep an eye on now. And it's a lot. That's why I said in my first slide for this section, like talk to people around you, because that's how you start to come up with the story. And hopefully if you're keeping an eye on one thing, someone else is keeping an eye on something else, and you come together and figure out what the full story is. So what do I do with all this information? Betty says we're probably headed into a recession. Milk prices are, you know, probably going to move lower, not super low, but margins will be tight because of these increased feed and input costs in the next year. What in the world is a dairy farmer to do about this? Well, I don't know that the message is that much different than it has been historically, but oh, I went one slide too far. Sorry about that. Dairy farmers must manage their risk, and you need to know your cost of production. So sometimes managing risk is just whatever, I'm going to take a position, I'm going to manage my margin, I'll enroll in a government program, which a lot of people in the Midwest do. When I was out east in Pennsylvania, not as many people are enrolled in some of those programs, but yeah, maybe take a position, whatever it might be. That's all fine and well. That's one way to manage risk. But there are other ways to manage risk. And that could be that, you know what, I'm going to start making a value-added product. I'm going to diversify. And whatever, I'll put up a poultry barn or something. I am going to expand. I have a lot of cash right now. I can get some, I see that land prices are moving lower. I can get some cheap land. I got a kid coming home. I'm going to expand. Maybe you're an older generation who's trying to bring in a younger generation. Maybe it's creatively gifting to try to manage that debt load so that the farm isn't gone. Because there's a very broad definition of risk. So, you know, it can be a risk of like my farm won't continue on and I want it to. And then also just lobbying for farms and lobbying for policies that make sense too is another way to manage risk. And if you haven't, I put this in, I was out east presenting and I added this because their participation rates in these programs is pretty low. We're much higher in the Midwest, but enroll in these government subsidized programs, because essentially if it's subsidized, it's free money and it's a way for you to manage your risk. So know your cost of production. And to lenders out there, I'll throw this out there too, help your farmers know their cost of production. A long time ago, I was a lender. I'm at 12:45, I'm going to wrap up. A long time ago, I was a lender, and I don't know, all my producers should have known their cost of production and none of them did. And now it's 20 years later, and I think a lot of producers still don't know their cost of production. You need to know your cost of production. So whatever you can do to help your farmers understand that and know their numbers so it doesn't seem so overwhelming, I would strongly encourage that. So with that, here's what I talked about today. Are we headed towards a recession? Yeah, things are shaping up that we very well may be, or certain parts of the world. If there is a recession, what does that mean? Well, demand will probably come off, but we have some supply things playing into place too, where we shouldn't see the bottom fall out of the market. And what am I watching? the basic things you think of, GDP, CPI, interest rates, but also some of these more qualitative things like weather and policy. So with that, I'll take questions. This has been a very interesting webinar to just talk at myself for the whole time. So I would really welcome any questions. And Fred, maybe I think you're going to facilitate that.
I believe that Jim Sulfur, my cohort from Minnesota, will also be helping. If folks want to go ahead and type in the chat or just give a hand wave there on your computer and unmute yourself. We're a small enough group. We will do it in an orderly fashion. While we're waiting for some of that action to have, you mentioned supply management and talked about, if you have a base, you can only ship so many pounds. What do you see happening with these additional fees on the milk check, the diesel fee, something like Foremost did a month and a half ago? Do you see that becoming the way of the world, so to speak?
I think in times of increase, where costs increase that much, yeah, that may become something. It's something that's happened before too, from what I understand. I don't know that it's going to be the norm moving forward, but I suppose in a time where, we under budgeted and we need to figure out how to pay this, unfortunately, it may just get handed down to the producer.
And, that can get transferred into the discussion of the make allowances, as we talk about in the hearings for changes in that program. Jim, did you come up with
I've got a question. Betty, I know you've worked in a previous life, you worked for General Mills as a buyer. Maybe you had mentioned that. So you kind of keep track of this whole milk-based alternative dairy products, kind of consumer supply and demand. I know this is looking out a long ways, but do you have any opinions, comments, thoughts on where dairy is going to end up? Because I sometimes believe farmers think we're going to lose out to these plant-based beverages. So do you have any thoughts on where that whole supply demand combination of all these alternatives are going to end up? Or
yeah, I have some thoughts on that. So if you look at, the data on fluid milk consumption here in the US, it's been on the decline, and it was on the decline even before all these plant-based beverages came into the picture, like they have in the last few years. So that sounds really doomy and gloomy. That said, we've seen cheese and butter and other dairy commodity demand increase. So what's going to happen with plant-based beverages, I'm not totally sure, to be honest with you. I think there's a market out there for it. I think some people exclusively drink that. When you think about who is mostly drinking milk right now, it's kids. Kids need calcium. No child wants to eat, I don't know if it's 5 cups of broccoli or something. I mean, it's some ginormous, it's a huge amount. You can tell I have kids, I said ginormous, some very large amount, copious amounts of kale and broccoli would have to be consumed to get your RDA of calcium, and no child is going to do that. Most kids aren't going to anyway. So, there's still going to be a market for fluid milk. And what we see is people just trading out of fluid milk into other dairy commodities. So, if that's what you see your consumers doing, and these are potentially higher value products anyway, with butter and cheese, maybe that's where you put your energies. Maybe those are the products that you promote, and work with the pediatricians and the doctors to continue to remind parents that no child wants to eat 5 cups of broccoli a day to get their calcium, and they do need calcium for strong bones. Work that market, work the fluid milk kid market, and call it a day.
I've got another global question for you. Betty, a lot of the world has been essentially at 0% interest rate for a long time. I mean, these interest rates, if you're a little older like I am, for sure, interest rates of 6 to 10% were sort of the norm until probably the mid 2000s or late 1990s. And so how is Europe going to fix a recession when you've essentially got 0% interest rates? Where do you go from there? I know they've done some other things, but where is this as much as psychological, or do you have any opinions on interest rates kind of moving forward? And what are some of these countries that are zero interest rates going to do if we do head into a recession?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was trying to get the interest rate chart pulled up too. Yeah, we're certainly not back where we were in the 80s, right? So that's always good. So your question though is just around, what does this mean? You know, will interest rates be raised if we are headed into a recession? I'm not sure anybody really totally knows. I think in some parts of the world, because they're headed towards a recession and interest rates are close to zero, I'm not sure that their central bank is going to want to raise interest rates, right? Because that may not spur on additional, that's not going to spur on additional spending, which is what you need when you're headed into a recession. And I mean, I'm trying to remember, right around the time COVID happened, I think Japan had negative interest rates then, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's a good way of the world either. That's the last thing I'm suggesting. But I mean, that kind of is the trouble with the really low interest rates and then a recession. You wind up, if you want to drop interest rates during a recession, you wind up with a negative interest rate. And you can look at, what's happened in Japan over the last 30 years, in the late 80s and early 90s, they were, poised to become the global economic leader. And then they hit the last decade of the 90s and really didn't grow much. And now I don't know that a lot has changed there. They're certainly still a developed nation, but what's going to happen? I don't know that they would raise interest rates. And I mean, we've seen some countries go towards negative interest rates. So, maybe that is what they do. It's tough to say. But if you're in a recession, it just seems like with modern monetary policy, the response would not be, I'm going to raise interest rates in the middle of a recession. It would be, more quantitative easing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just going to be a kind of a challenge as we go forward.
Jim, we've got a couple of questions come in on the chat. First one is, if China were to invade Taiwan, what would be the fallout for U.S. dairy exports?
Oh, that's a good question. So New Zealand is the #1 supplier to China, and they have a free trade agreement with New Zealand. I think what might be interesting, the U.S. might not, there could be something, an embargo or something that would happen where the U.S. wouldn't send things to China or take things from China. That said, that's not really in anybody's best interest either, right? So it's kind of an interesting question. I guess just to answer it very simply, if we don't have exports to China, what does that do to U.S. dairy exports? Well, it lowers them, but most of our product goes to Mexico, Canada, South Korea. So sure, we're lower, but it's not like we're losing our #1 customer. I think the more interesting thing that could happen is what is the response at a federal level because we are very reliant on China for imports. They're not as reliant on us. So if they did something like that, would the U.S. say we're not going to export or buy your stuff anymore? We would kind of be in a world of hurt. And then when you think about some of the other countries that China does business with, like New Zealand, again, same thing. Are they so reliant on China that they wouldn't really be able to do much about it anyway? Does that answer the question?
I think so.
Okay.
Second question is, do you think U.S. dairy exports will continue to grow? And what products in that mix will drive growth if you see it growing?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a room at the table for growth in U.S. dairy exports, especially, I already mentioned other countries have been buying our product because it's been available. What products will grow? Butter grew over the summer, but if you think about exports of butter over the summer, that butter was booked back in the spring when prices weren't, $3.25 a pound. So when it was cheaper, in other words, maybe not butter right now in the near term, but longer term, potentially that could be an area. I would say cheese. Cheese would be my top pick though. What dairy export's gonna grow? I would say cheese. When you look at like restaurants around the globe, Burger King, Yum Brands, they have presence in all places in Asia. So those places are demanding cheese, and then consumers are too. Those would be the big ones. So I would say, I mean, I think there's room for growth too with non-fat dry milk powder, especially the New Zealand's kind of had like the corner on the powder market, but as they're limited in their growth, and as some of these places like China and Southeast Asia demand more powder, you know, there's room for the US to expand their market share there too.
We thank you. We just had an election, and obviously whatever side you're on, you can throw brickbats or bouquets. But do you see a change in labor and immigration? The last decade, that's become the leading cost right behind feed. And it's hard to get. It's not just the dairymen. I'm in a part of the world where we have a lot of harvest centers, and brand new center, it's only running 2 shifts because they can't get the labor for the 3rd shift. Post-election, what do you see happening in the labor / immigration?
Well, I mean, I think even before the election and in the last few years, we've seen a lot of farms start to implement robots, right? So, I mean, I just wonder if dairy farmers will try to outsmart the system. So I can't find help. I'm going to outsource it. I'll buy a robot. I know when I went to Europe a number of years ago, and I was in Ireland, the guy had, I can't remember how big this parlor was, but it was way oversized for the number of cows. And I was like, why in the world do you have such a big parlor? And he's like, I'm the only one that milks. So it's cheaper for me to have to have this really big parlor and get done in an hour and a half than to have a smaller parlor and hire someone. So I think as labor costs, you know, go up, some of these other things like robots or bigger, I don't know if anyone's putting in bigger parlors. This was a while ago, but I think those are the things that we wind up seeing. You know, will policy change? I don't know. Let me think here. The Republicans have control of the House, and we're still trying to figure out who has control of the Senate, right? But obviously, when you got 2 different parties in power, it just makes it hard to get a lot done. So, you know, I don't know if much will change in terms of immigration laws or otherwise. But I personally just think that farmers may just try to, you know, game the system and come up with other ways to be more efficient, because that's what human beings do. That's what farmers do. We try to figure out how can we be more efficient? How can we just get around this? Because this is a headache, and how can I control what I can control?
I really like the part of that answer about moving away from labor and prepaying it with whether it's robots or some other mechanics. And I believe Jim probably concurs with that.
Yeah, just as a comment to people, of course, Betty was helping develop, we developed a robot model looking at, and when you look at, usually when we look at 1,500 cow dairies with double 24 parlors, if we used 1 to 2% wage inflation over 20 years, the parlors were much more profitable. Now, if you look at farm labor has gone up about 4 to 6% over the last couple of years. When you use in our models and you use the 4 to 6% wage inflation, all of a sudden robots become much more economical, even for larger dairies. So I think if we continue to have this pressure on wage costs and availability, I think you're right, Betty and Fred. I just think that's where people are headed. And we've been doing that for decades, right? That's why gutter cleaners went in. We just swapped out labor for capital, or we used capital as a substitute for labor. So it's been happening for a long time.
Well, and I think too, like, look at retail stores now. I live by a really big mall. The mall is hardly open. Like, we kind of joke about it around here, but it's not open all the time. Like, it's not open 9 to 8 at night anymore. They can't find help. So they figured out it's cheaper just to be open 10 to 6 and have one person work. I don't have to have the headache of constantly trying to find labor or paying somebody a whole bunch of money. I make more, people just find different ways to optimize. So even this, I'm going from 3 shifts to 2 shifts, like, yeah, I could see how that could potentially, even though you're losing milk, losing some revenue, that the costs are that much lower that it might pencil.
Yeah, I saw, and that we've got a brand new Quick Trip for people that may not be in the upper Midwest. It's like a gas station, i.e. really convenience store. And this is the first one I've seen with self-checkouts. Not all self-checkouts, but they had self-checkout. So I think you're seeing retailers, that's, now you see the kiosks in the fast food restaurants, right? Where you don't go up and order your food, you order your food. Somebody might give it to you, but you're there, you pay. So I think it's going to be automation. Oh, here's another question. Can I read this? Do you see the consolidation of the dairy industry speeding up or slowing down with increased cost of production?
Oh, this is such a depressing question, huh? And there's no right answer. I mean, I guess what I like to tell producers is, if you're good and your cost of production and you can find ways to differentiate yourself, there's room at the table for you and you're probably going to survive. You have to know how to manage these risks. But I mean, I guess if you look at history, like, there's been consolidation of the dairy industry and of other industries too, hog, poultry, just even within the agricultural community too. Like, when you look at co-ops and things, like look at grocery stores, it's all been consolidation. I'm not saying I like it, but yeah, I mean, I imagine there will be, more bigger dairies in the future. Look at the dairies they're building over in China. They're huge. I'm not saying it's the best way to do it either, but yeah, I would anticipate that there'll be more consolidation. It certainly makes it, I think, like in Australia and Europe, one of the things that we're seeing is just that people retire. Like, they're tired of it all, like tired of trying to figure out how to do it all. So they're just retiring. So maybe people are profitable, but they're just not going to continue to do it. And so we'll see an exodus, continue to see an exodus that way. But yeah, I would say yes. Yeah, of course, there'll be more consolidation in the industry.
Okay, while we're waiting for the next question from the audience, I'd like to circle back to one of your comments. You talked about the environmental rules that the world is having in place. A lot of them revolve around water. How important is that as we make our plans for our dairy, whether it's expansion or retirement? It gets a lot of talk, but is that something every dairyman ought to have in the back of his mind as he makes his plans?
It would seem wise to me. I mean, I would not be afraid to draw parallels from policy in other part of the world, or to ask yourself the question, is this setting a precedent for what could happen here in the US, and then make plans accordingly. Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things that are happening in other parts of the world in terms of policy, maybe they're not here yet, but yeah, it's not unlikely that they won't be here in the future, whether that's 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. So I would be trying to stay on top of what is going on in other parts of the world. What are dairy producers having to think about there? And what might that mean for me here? Because the last thing you want to do is get kind of, penned in, right? Or feel like you missed thinking about something. You can't make yourself crazy, but yeah, that would be wise. I mean, that's part of strategic planning, looking beyond the end of your nose, looking beyond the end of today or this year, and looking out, 5 or 10 years. What is this going to mean for me long term?
Thank you. Jim, any last final follow-ups?
No, just thanks, Betty. I think that was really informative, and I think it's interesting as we think about all the things that are going on in the world and how we might adapt like we always have, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like sometimes when I give these talks, they're kind of like just Debbie Downers, like, yeah, the industry's probably going to consolidate, lower milk prices, less demand, but yeah, we will adapt. Like some of these things, people will just figure out, like we always have. And there's really exciting things happening too. There is a resurgence like in local foods. There's really exciting work going on in the sustainability space. I talked about this when you and I did the podcast, but I researched anaerobic digesters in 2008, and they really weren't profitable and they were super expensive. And like, we couldn't totally figure out why the fixed cost was just so very high and how other parts of the world could do it. And guess what? Here in the US, a lot of people are doing it now. Like they figured out how to manage, we've adapted, we've figured it out, found policies, ways to make it affordable. So it just means today we don't have it all solved out, but it doesn't mean that we're not smart enough to figure some of these things out in the future, if we're willing to work hard and, be resilient.
Thank you, Betty. Appreciate the insights you shared with us today. I'd like to ask our folks out there who are listening to scroll up just a little bit and take a moment of your time and complete the evaluation for this program. We will be taking a month off in December and then coming back in January with our monthly I-29 webinars. Again, thank you, Betty, for your time and the insights you shared with us. And we'll look forward to seeing folks after the first of the year.
Very good. Thanks, Fred.